Hello everyone, we are ready for chapter 49 of The Treasure Hunter's Tale. We're nearly at the end. The evening grew dusk and still there was no sign of the men. The women started shooting nervous glances at one another when they thought the children weren't looking. No one said anything and all just carried on with their work. By now the soup was bubbling and the fire had to be kicked down a little so that the soup could just simmer. They decided to eat as they really didn't know when or if the others would join them, although no one said as much. Ian yawned. He wanted so desperately to stay up for the triumphant return, for he felt sure it would be triumphant because he had heard the officers say it wouldn't be a fool's errand, and he understood what that meant. But he could feel his eyes closing. Mrs. Beloved of the King drew up a blanket. "Why don't you go to bed, darling, and I promise to wake you up as soon as we know they are coming back." Ian looked at his mother. "Promise," he said, taking the blanket from her. "Promise," said his mother. "You too, Hope," she said, turning to her daughter. Hope kissed the ladies good night and crawled into her cosy tree-fort bedroom. It was rather exciting camping out like this, and she snuggled under her blanket. Granted, the ground wasn't smooth and soft like her bed, but it would do. She was so tired. "Ian, Hope, action stations," called out Mrs. Beloved of the King. The children woke suddenly. "What time is it?" asked Hope. Mrs. Beloved of the King looked up at the moon. "I should say nearly midnight," she whispered. "Now quick, get up, for we can see lights coming up the road." It had been arranged that Ian would be the lookout, for which he was very pleased. He was small, and if the lights on the road weren't their party, he could just creep back without being noticed. He tiptoed to the bushes that skirted the spinney and crouched down. Along the path he could see the dim flicker of lights, and they were definitely coming closer, but there was something about the way they were coming which gave Ian a feeling that all was not as it should be. He tried to breathe quieter as the lights got nearer, and then saw to his horror that it was two large men in striped jerseys. They were clearly running away, and Ian thought they were going to run past, but then he heard something that made his blood run cold. "In here," said a gruff voice, and the light started heading towards the spinney. "We can lay low in here tonight, and then we'll make our escape proper tomorrow," said the voice. Ian ran back to the camp as quickly and quietly as he could to sound the alarm. "Quick!" he hoarsely whispered. "Pirates! Man your weapons!" The women leapt up, all immediately bracing themselves for a fight. Hope drew her sword and gulped. This would be the first time she had ever had to use it in attack before, having only ever used it in defence in the past. She looked over at her mother, whose chest she could see was moving rapidly up and down. Even Miss Wait-on-the-Lord was standing ready, although her main weapon was prayer, and she knew it. The pirates, who were in fact planning on laying low until the morning, were surprised by the sight that met their eyes. "What's all this, then?" said one of the men, grabbing his cutlass. "We are women of the King," said Mrs. Ernest in a strong voice. "If you hurt us or harm us, you will have to answer to the King himself." "Oh, will we now?" jeered the pirates. One of them looked closer at Mrs. Beloved of the King. The moon was full and bright, so he could see her face clearly. "Yeah, I know you, don't I?" he said in a horrid voice. "You do," said Mrs. Beloved of the King. "I was a galley slave on the Maiden's Crosswind." "That's right," said the other man. "You made good grub too, if I recall." He looked at her in an uncomfortable way. "Not much good for anything else, though." Mrs. Beloved of the King prayed for strength, as did the rest of the ladies, for they felt this altercation could go one of several ways. "Still wearing that armour, I see," leered the other man. "Did nothing for your figure, love," he said dirtily. "This is armour from the King. It is given to protect us," said the brave lady firmly. "Well, I think we're just going to have to see if it works then," said one of the men, stepping forward menacingly, "because we need to have a place to lay low till the morning, see?" He took another pace forward. "Yeah," agreed his mate, "because this is our camp now." He too started walking slowly towards the women and children. Hope was really scared. These men meant to harm them, she was sure, and she hid behind her mother a little, but she still held on to her sword. Ian, who in the confrontation had managed to sneak off behind the trees, was now creeping up behind the men, his sword held out ready to strike if they should try anything. The women all stood their ground with their shields up and their swords up and ready. The man who was at the front took another step forward and raised his cutlass. He was now close enough that if it came down it would surely strike one of the women, and Ian knew it. He ran forward out of his hiding place and slashed the man on the wrist, making him drop his cutlass. Ian tried to kick it out of the way, but the other man made a grab for him. But thanks to his armour, he was rather difficult to get a hold of, and he was able to wriggle free. At this, the women, seeing that the men really did mean to attack them, went into action. They screamed and yelled and charged at the two men, who, it must be said, were quite surprised at the fierceness of the band of women, but they fought back all the same. Hope found she was low enough that she could swipe at the men's ankles, which made them have to hop with the pain. Because of this, they were very unstable, and so Mrs. Ernest was able to shove one of them over with the front of her shield with her weight behind it, and then followed through with the edge of it, ramming it down on the man's stomach, which immobilised him for a time. Mrs. My Weakness's strength had backed the other man, whose wrist Iron had slashed, against a very prickly thorn bush, and Mrs. Beloved of the King came to help her, as did Hope. They had him essentially pinned from each side now, and he was cursing and snarling at them. Just then there was a shout, and they were suddenly surrounded by other men carrying torches and weapons. But these were friends. Iron had run down the hill as fast as he could in the hopes of coming across the returning band to raise the alarm and get them to come and help, for he knew that the ladies were not going to be able to hold the men off for long. When the returning fighters saw Iron running down the hill, they knew something was wrong, so all who could run and weren't injured immediately braced themselves for more fighting as they followed Iron. Iron was so thankful that he didn't have to go far to find them, which meant that they didn't have to run too far uphill, which is always harder, to come to the rescue.